Ulysses S. Grant is often remembered for his leadership as general in the American Civil War, but his time in office has sparked a wide range of public opinion. From his Reconstruction policies to the numerous political scandals that erupted around him. In today's episode, we're going to look at his administration's policies, accomplishments, and challenges, and how that all culminated in his re-election in 1872. Let's get started. Grant was born in Ohio, the first of 6 children, and he really stood out as a young boy, but not the way you might expect for a future military commander. Grant was small, quiet, sensitive, but what really set him apart as unique was his extraordinary talent with horses. In fact, his skills with animals became legendary in his hometown. Despite his reserved nature, however, Grant was destined for bigger things. He attended the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point in New York, where he honed skills that would serve him well later in life. Grant excelled in mathematics, writing, drawing, and, you guessed it, horsemanship, all of which played a part in shaping the disciplined leader that he would become. After graduating at West Point, Grant was assigned to an infantry company in Missouri, but soon found himself heading south as tensions with Mexico over Texas territory began heating up. From 1846 to 1848, Grant fought in the Mexican-American War, earning commendations for bravery not once, but twice. Grant's experience in this war helped shape his future as a military strategist and was a preview of things to come. After the war, Grant will be posted at several different locations throughout the country, from Detroit to New York and even the rugged Pacific Northwest. In 1854, however, Grant is going to make a surprising decision to resign from the Army in order to move back to the Midwest to be closer to family. During this time, Grant's going to try his hand at several different jobs, from farming to selling insurance, and even working in his family's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. Times were tough for Grant during these years, but through it all, he found support from his loving wife, Julia Dent Grant, and their 4 children. Everything changed when the American Civil War broke out in 1861, and the Union was in desperate need of experienced military officers, and Grant's services were quickly called upon. He was tasked with the job of turning the rowdy and undisciplined 21st Illinois Voluntary Infantry Regiment into a fighting force. Under his leadership, this unit will become a disciplined unit, and his no-nonsense approach will quickly earn him their respect. And his efforts won't go unnoticed by the Army either, as he will be promoted to Brigadier General in short order. Grant began to carve out a name for himself as a fearless commander, especially in the Western theater of the war. His victories were stacking up. He captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee and secured the surrender of Vicksburg, Mississippi in one of the most critical campaigns of the war. His ability to outmaneuver and defeat larger Confederate forces like at Chattanooga, Tennessee, earned him national recognition. However, Grant's aggressive strategies also led to high casualties, and he faced criticism as well as praise for his willingness to endure heavy losses to achieve victory. By 1865, Grant's relentless strategy paid off when he directed Union forces in the siege of Petersburg, Virginia, ultimately leading to Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The American Civil War was over, and Grant emerged as the hero for the Union and one of the most revered men in the nation. But Grant's story doesn't end with the war. Just as he was riding high on his military successes, the nation was plunged into chaos. President Lincoln was assassinated in April of '65, and his Vice President Andrew Johnson struggled to navigate the post-war political landscape. Johnson's very lenient Reconstruction policies angered many Republicans who wanted to see harsher penalties for Confederate officers and more guaranteed protections for the newly freed slaves. The country was at a crossroads, and in the election of 1868, it was clear that the nation needed a strong and unifying leader. Enter Ulysses S. Grant. The Republicans turned to the war hero, and Grant, ever a man of few words, summed up his approach to a nation in turmoil with a simple but powerful message. Let us have peace. This message resonated with a public fatigued by war. Grant easily won the election, becoming the 18th president of the United States. His presidency, like his military career, was a combination of both triumphs and controversy. But in 1868, he was exactly what the country needed. A symbol of strength and unity as America tried to heal from the scars of war. When Ulysses S. Grant took the reins in 1869, he was entering uncharted territory. Unlike many previous presidents, Grant had very little political experience. His background was rooted in military command, and that approach shaped the way he governed. Grant made it clear from the outset that he intended to rise above partisan politics. Unlike other politicians who used appointments to reward supporters, Grant valued personal loyalty and competence over political connections. This idealistic stance set him at odds with the Republican Party leaders who expected the spoils of victory after their support for him in his election campaign. Instead, Grant's cabinet appointments reflected his personal preferences, and many of those he chose had little experience in governance. His selection of Hamilton Fish as Secretary of State was one of his wisest decisions. Fish was a level-headed diplomatic leader who steered foreign policy with remarkable skill. However, the rest of Grant's cabinet appointees were far less successful. His administration had a high turnover rate in cabinet positions, with many of them ending in outright failure. Grant's loyalty was both a strength and a weakness. He tended to trust those around him even when they were ineffective or corrupt, opening the door to numerous scandals and tarnishing the reputation of his administration. One such scandal, which we'll touch on more later, was the Credit Mobilier affair, a financial scandal involving the Union Pacific Railroad that came to light in 1872, just as Grant was preparing for his re-election campaign. And while Grant was never specifically implicated in any of the scandals, the perception of widespread corruption under his watch certainly colored public opinion. Grant's administration had to balance two competing priorities: preserving the Union and ensuring that the rights of the newly freed African Americans were protected, all the while trying to prohibit a resurgence of Confederate power. Reconstruction had already been underway for several years when Grant took office, and the nation was struggling to define what freedom really meant for former slaves. While slavery had been abolished, the battle for civil rights was far from over. Southern states were finding new ways to disenfranchise and oppress African Americans, and the federal government had to decide how much it was willing to intervene. Grant aligned himself with the radical Republicans in Congress who sought to use federal power to enforce civil rights legislation in the South. He supported the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote, and it became law during his presidency in 1870. He proudly signed off on the amendment, citing it as a milestone of immense importance. But passing a law is one thing. Enforcing a law is something completely different. In this context, the Reconstruction amendments brought about landmark change. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment extended citizenship and equal protection under the law. And now the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote. For the first time, African Americans were attending schools. They were building their own churches. They were actively participating in politics, and with some even holding seats in local, state, and yes, federal government. This rapid progression was met with severe backlash from many white Southerners who deeply resented these changes. Seeing the Republican Party as the driving force behind African American emancipation and empowerment, some turned to extreme measures to restore the Old South and remove Republicans from power in the South. This opposition went beyond mere political difference. It erupted into acts of violent resistance, especially by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who emerged as a powerful and destructive force during Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan, born in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866, initially seemed like an odd organization. 6 Confederate veterans, restless in peacetime, formed a group for the purpose of playing pranks. But as the Klan grew and spread across the South, its purpose darkened. Its members became deeply involved in terrorizing newly freed Black Americans who were exercising their new rights and attacking white Southerners who supported the Republican agenda. The Klan's methods were brutal and calculated. They burned down schools and churches, assaulted those who attempted to vote, and even resorted to horrifying tactics like rape and murder. Often cloaked in ghostly disguises, Klan members carried out their crimes under the cover of night, spreading fear in Black communities and creating an atmosphere of dread. Worse, local officials and law enforcement often sympathized with or outright supported the Klan, meaning that few perpetrators were ever prosecuted. Facing this string of violence, President Grant was increasingly concerned about the Klan's unchecked brutality. He saw firsthand how these acts of terror threatened the very outcome of the Civil War and the freedoms it had established. However, his options for enforcement were limited. The U.S. military had downsized significantly since the war, and federal resources were spread thin. In a letter to House Speaker James G. Blaine, Grant expressed his frustration, highlighting the dire need for federal intervention. There is, Grant writes, a deplorable state of affairs existing in some portions of the South where the present civil authority fails to secure that end. I feel that we should have such legislation. In response, Congress passed a series of what they called force acts to try to combat the Klan's influence in the South. The first, known as the Enforcement Act of 1870, made it illegal for anyone to use disguise or force to intimidate anyone exercising their constitutional rights. The second, passed in 1871, gave the federal government oversight in elections through judges and marshals. The third, more commonly known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, went a step further. It granted the president the power to suspend habeas corpus and deploy the military to enforce these laws. Grant wasted no time. In May of 1871, he issued a proclamation warning that violent actions against citizens would not be tolerated. In his address, he urged Southerners to protect the rights of all citizens and warned that he would use executive power to secure the equal protection of all under the law. Despite limited federal resources, Grant took decisive action in South Carolina where some of the most extreme violence was taking place. When Klan members in South Carolina ignored his warning, Grant suspended habeas corpus in 9 counties, declared martial law, and deployed the 7th U.S. Cavalry. This show of force led to the arrest of numerous Klan members, many of whom were brought to trial in partnership with the newly created Department of Justice under Attorney General Amos Ackerman. Ackerman, a staunch advocate for Reconstruction, played a critical role in these trials and made it very clear that the federal government would no longer tolerate this wave of domestic terror. Grant's actions did see some success in temporarily suppressing the Klan's influence in that many members went into hiding or fled. However, Grant's administration was still stretched very thin with its resources, and that caused many of those who were prosecuted to receive light sentences. Opposition to Grant's efforts grew, with critics accusing him of federal overreach. And eventually, the Klan's influence will wane, but it's not because of the prosecutions. It will be because that white Southerners will regain control in Southern legislatures. On the economic front, Grant faced a host of challenges. His presidency was marked by a struggle over the nation's fiscal policy, especially the debate over paper money, known as greenbacks, versus hard currency backed by gold. The Civil War had necessitated the widespread use of greenbacks in order to finance the Union's war effort, but this created an inflationary environment, and many fiscal conservatives, including Grant, wanted to see a return to a gold standard. In 1869, the young administration of Ulysses S. Grant became embroiled in one of the most infamous financial scandals of the era, remembered as Black Friday. This scandal revolved around an attempt by two notorious Wall Street speculators, Jay Gould and James Fisk, to manipulate the price of gold and gain immense profits at the expense of the wider economy. Gould and Fisk were well known for their aggressive business tactics and for using political connections to further their schemes. These two men hatched a plan to corner the gold market, which meant that they would try to buy up as much gold as possible, driving up the price. If successful, they would then sell it at an artificially high price, reaping huge benefits. However, for their plan to work, they needed to ensure that the U.S. government, which held significant gold reserves, would not sell any gold to stabilize the market. If the government released its gold, it would increase supply, driving down prices and undermining their cornering scheme. To exert influence, Gould and Fisk went to great lengths to ingratiate themselves with Grant's inner circle, even bringing in Grant's brother-in-law, Abel Corbin, who was married to Grant's sister. Corbin was used as their intermediary, conveying their ideas and suggesting that a high price in gold would boost farmers' earnings, presenting it as beneficial for the country. They hoped that Corbin could sway the president to temporarily stop gold sales, creating the perfect environment for their plan. Initially, Grant was unaware of the scheme, and Gould and Fisk's influence seemed to be working as the government withheld its gold from the market. This hesitation, likely not intentional on Grant's part, began to drive up gold prices. The frenzy in the market peaked when rumors spread that the federal government might soon act, and gold prices skyrocketed from $132 per ounce to over $160 per ounce, an extraordinary leap that generated massive profits for Gould and Fisk while also causing severe inflation fears. When Grant eventually caught wind of the manipulation, he recognized the danger that the artificially inflated market posed to the economy. On September 24, 1869, later dubbed Black Friday, Grant ordered the Treasury to release $4 million in gold, thereby flooding the market. The sudden influx of government-held gold sent prices plunging, triggering a market crash. Investors who had purchased gold at inflated prices suffered significant losses, triggering a financial panic that rippled through the economy. Though Grant was not directly involved in the scheme and had acted to protect the economy, the scandal damaged his administration's reputation. Many Americans already wary of speculation and corruption saw the episode as a sign of Grant's naivete in financial matters. Critics argued that he was too easily influenced by those around him, especially through family connections, and that his administration had failed to prevent access by unscrupulous businessmen. However, the Credit Mobilier scandal was one of the most notorious cases of political corruption in the 19th century, severely tarnishing the reputation of many prominent politicians. Though the scandal's origins predated Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, its exposure during his first term in office further highlighted the growing problem of corruption in government and cast a dark shadow over his administration, particularly due to the involvement of his vice president, Schuyler Colfax. The Credit Mobilier of America was a construction company created by Union Pacific Railroad executives in the 1860s as a part of the government-funded effort to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The company's purpose was straightforward. It would be contracted by the Union Pacific to complete segments of the railroad, but with one significant catch. The contracts were massively overinflated. By overcharging the government for construction costs, the executives reaped enormous profits, essentially exploiting public funds for private gain. To keep the scheme hidden and protect the lucrative setup, executives from Credit Mobilier began to use some of their profits to bribe influential politicians, even giving them discounted or free shares in their company. This ensured that the politicians would turn a blind eye to the excessive charges and potential conflicts of interest in awarding government contracts. Although the bribery and price inflation practices began in the Lincoln and Johnson administrations, the schemes didn't come to the public's attention until Grant's first term in 1872. By this point in time, rumors and leaks were already circulating about the corrupt dealings. The New York Sun broke the story, revealing that key members of Congress had already received shares in Credit Mobilier, implicating dozens of politicians in what was quickly seen as a monumental abuse of public trust. The investigation that followed uncovered that many high-ranking politicians, including sitting Vice President Schuyler Colfax, had accepted shares. Colfax, a well-regarded Republican from Indiana, had been Speaker of the House before becoming Grant's Vice President in 1869. His involvement in the scandal was particularly damaging as it underscored a disturbing trend. Top officials were becoming intertwined with big business interests, often at the expense of taxpayers. This scandal provided fuel for critics who argued that the Grant administration was failing to prevent corruption and that Grant himself was either unwilling or unable to maintain control over the people he placed in positions of power. The scandal sent shockwaves through Washington and proved embarrassing for Grant, who was not personally implicated, but his administration's integrity was called into question. The Credit Mobilier affair further illustrates the depth of corruption of those in high office and reinforced public cynicism toward government. It came to symbolize the Gilded Age era of politics, which historian Mark Twain famously described as one of substantial corruption covered by a thin veneer of respectability and prosperity. For Grant, the scandal's repercussions were immediate. The involvement of his vice president, Colfax, became a political liability as Grant prepared for his re-election in 1872. Determined to avoid further controversy, Grant chose not to keep Colfax on the Republican ticket. Instead, Colfax was replaced by Henry Wilson, a senator from Massachusetts with a reputation of integrity, signaling an attempt by Grant to restore public confidence in his administration. However, the Credit Mobilier affair was not easily forgotten. The scandal fueled further accusations that Grant was indifferent to corruption or that he had poor judgment in the officials he appointed. The scandal also tarnished the legacy of many respected politicians and furthered the disillusionment that many had with the Republican Party despite its central role in the post-Civil War Reconstruction and reform efforts. For Grant, this further adds to the list of controversies that would come to define his presidency, despite his efforts to promote reform and honest governance. Another major scandal, which we'll look at in the next episode, is the whiskey ring, which took place in Grant's second term. And while Grant will act quickly once the scandal is uncovered, the perception of widespread corruption had already taken hold. Another significant aspect of Grant's first term was his approach to Native American policy. Unlike his predecessors, Grant wanted to reform the way the federal government dealt with Native Americans. In his inaugural address, he pledged to treat the Native American peoples with more respect, even referring to them as the original occupants of this land. This led to what became known as the Peace Policy, which aimed to place Native Americans on reservations and encourage them to adopt farming as a means of becoming self-sufficient. Grant appointed Eli Parker, a Seneca Indian, as Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the first Native American to hold such a position in the federal government. He also created a board of Indian commissioners to combat corruption in the system. However, despite these good intentions, the peace policy was not a resounding success. White settlers continued to encroach on Native American lands, and conditions on reservations were often poor. The Army was still used to enforce Indian policies, and many Native Americans faced continued hardships and resistance to their way of life. Grant's policy, while progressive for its time, fell short of creating lasting improvements for Native communities. By the time the 1872 presidential election rolled around, the Republican Party was facing internal divisions. The liberal Republicans emerged as a faction in opposition to Grant's administration, criticizing both his tolerance of corruption and his heavy-handed use of federal power in the South. They sought to restore the party, believing that Grant had not lived up to the ideals of true reform and moral leadership. Led by such figures like Senator Carl Schurz and Charles Sumner, they sought civil service reform and the end to what they viewed as excessive Reconstruction policies in the South. The liberal Republicans are going to nominate Horace Greeley, a well-known newspaper editor and public intellectual. Horace Greeley was an odd candidate for many reasons. Despite being a Republican, he was famously inconsistent on many key issues. For example, during the Civil War, Greeley initially supported a conciliatory approach toward the South, but later called for a total war to destroy the Confederacy. He also advocated for emancipation, but held deeply contradictory views on race. Nevertheless, the Democrats, seeing an opportunity to defeat Grant, decided to endorse Greeley as their candidate, even though they didn't agree with him on many of his positions. And this coalition of liberal Republicans and Democrats created this strange fusion of reformers, disgruntled Republicans, and old guard Democrats, all hoping to defeat Grant. Grant's campaign strategy was relatively straightforward. He largely avoided the intense personal campaigning that Greeley engaged in, trusting that his record as the Union's victorious general and incumbent president would be enough to carry him through to victory. His supporters, however, painted Greeley as eccentric, erratic, and politically unreliable. Greeley, on the other hand, campaigned vigorously, giving speeches all over the country, attacking Grant's record and calling for an end to the corruption that had plagued his administration. Ultimately, Grant's victory was decisive. He won over 55% of the popular vote and carried 286 electoral votes to Greeley's paltry 66. Grant's support remained strong in the North, where his stance on Reconstruction and his Civil War legacy continued to resonate with voters. The South, where Greeley had hoped to gain significant support due to his call for amnesty towards former Confederates, remained largely out of reach due to Grant's enforcement of Reconstruction policies. The presidential election of 1872, however, is going to take a tragic turn for Greeley. After the election and before the Electoral College could cast its votes, Greeley is going to die from illness and exhaustion. His death is going to highlight the strange nature of this campaign and the intense toll it took on his body. His electoral votes will be scattered amongst several minor candidates, but the outcome was clear. Grant had won a second term. This election solidified Grant's standing, but it also foreshadowed the difficulties of his second term, as public tolerance for Reconstruction policies began to erode and scandals continued to plague his administration. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.